Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for ISACA Live. I'm ISACA's Chief Operating Officer, Simona Rollinson, and we have a great conversation with you today. And it's with George Sack. He's the founder and the principal of Two Harbors Consulting and a CMMI lead appraiser. George, thank you for joining us today to talk about CMMI Mythbusting, the misconceptions versus the realities.
Thank you so much, Simona. I really appreciate the opportunity to sit here and meet with you.
George works with CMMI users every day, and he has seen it done well and badly for organizations of all sizes, industries, and geographies. So we're going to dive into some common misconceptions about CMMI and what the real story is. But first and foremost, I'd like to ask you, George, to give us your 30-second elevator pitch about CMMI and how it helps organizations worldwide.
Sure. So CMMI is a maturity model by which best practices have been put together over 3+ decades. It's applicable for businesses of all types, small businesses, large businesses. While initially it was used mostly in a defensive contractor setting, it's been used in all types of businesses. Medical devices, telecommunications, aerospace, transportation, communications. And it serves as a method by which an organization can benchmark themselves against those best practices. And then by way of that, they can then start to establish a path for improving against those particular best practices.
Thank you for that. So let's get into myth number one. CMMI is only for large organizations, and people have different definitions about large. Some are thinking probably revenue-wise, let's say $100 million or $500 million organization. What would you say to that?
So I've had the opportunity to work with CMMI in the large setting, be it as measured by way of revenue or by way of number of people in an organization or some number of products. But CMMI is also very applicable in the small setting. One of the participants in the Medical Device Discovery Appraisal Program, that program that uses CMMI in conjunction with the Medical Device Innovation Consortium and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that's an organization of less than 20 people. Even within large organizations, many of the groups that I've worked with have been small groups, meaning organizations lesser than 50 people. And the reason why it works, Simona, is because those teams or those organizations, just like large organizations, they have processes that they are looking to benchmark or assess as to how they're performing and are looking to improve. So while you may be in a large organization, how you plan your work, how you manage your work, how you monitor your work, how you use measures in your work, that's applicable regardless if you're a large organization, medium-sized organization, small organization. And I would say even in the large organization, you don't have to look at it as just the large organization. You can look at it using CMMI in different functions in your organization. So actually taking that bigger problem and breaking it into smaller chunks, smaller teams. I think actually in many cases, looking at it from that sort of scope makes it for a more effective implementation for a lot of groups. And how they go about applying the use of CMMI.
All right. So on to the next myth. I'm a software developer by training and by early career focus. So CMMI did start in the software development arena. So what about the myth that CMMI is only for software development, or a second part of the question, organizations that are bidding for government contracts?
Sure. So you're absolutely right. If my early days with CMMI as well, if you go back in the archaeology of the capability maturity model, well, that's what it was called. It was called CMM for software. And then there were other derivations of that, CMM for systems. The reason why we have the I there is because the model has been integrated. And so integration is part of its name because it's applicable for all types of development, all types of services, all types of work, right? Including consideration of people, data, measurements, acquisition. So while it does have its roots in software, it is commonly used in organizations for many things outside of software. Just came off an appraisal a couple of weeks ago where it was not just about software development, but the organization was also in sensor development, doing hardware type of development. But it's not even just for development, actually. Worked with organizations that use it for IT services, use it for people services, right? They are providing, some of those organizations are providing the service to people. They're providing the service to other organizations by augmenting their staff. And so, again, those organizations have, as a service organization, have requirements. They have planning that they have to do. They want to monitor those things. They're able to pull on those core parts of the model, what we often call practice areas, and leverage those to, again, help them improve their performance. It gives them a method by which they can benchmark where they're performing and then look to improve. So certainly still applicable for software, even though a lot about software development has changed in the 20, 30 years that the CMMI has been used, but also very applicable in many other settings as well. I recently worked with a company that does sterilization in the medical device field. There's not much from a software development perspective that, there may be software that's helping them in the delivery of sterilization service by way of gamma radiation, but they're a service organization, right? They are sterilizing medical device products that are going to be used by the U.S. public, right? So software development is not really in their business. Service to their customers is. And the CMMI and the practice areas within it are very applicable for organizations like that. To the second part of your question, yeah, it's also true that CMMI has often been used by defense subcontractors that are looking to show a level of maturity for the purposes of putting in a bid for a proposal. That's absolutely been true. It's still true today. It's part of the business strategy of some of those organizations. And I would say for businesses in that space, it often makes a lot of sense to demonstrate that you have the capabilities and that you're performing at a certain CMMI maturity level. However, it certainly is not the only application of CMMI. Again, you've heard me speak to the medical device discovery appraisal program, and that entire achieving a maturity rating for the purposes of getting a contract it's something that's not even a part of that particular program. And organizations, again, can leverage the CMMI just to, as much as they'd like, be it maturity rating, be it capability rating, be it leveraging the practices in a more ad hoc fashion the way they'd like to. They can use those to benchmark where they're at against those time-proven best practices, and then leverage that to identify a path forward to improve. So, the myth of, hey, I should only use this if I'm in a software business, I would say that's truly a myth. It's applicable for all types of businesses. The myth that it's only applicable for large businesses, as I talked about, it's also applicable for small businesses. And the myth that it's only necessary or only applicable in businesses that are looking to secure government contracts, also not true. It has application in small businesses, non-software businesses, as well as just a model that can be used for overall performance improvement.
Right. You sort of answered this question, but it's a good segue. So what would you say to people who think that they have to use all of the CMMI? So you mentioned different practice areas, different domains, whether it's people, supply chain, or they should use CMMI throughout the whole organization. Is it a whole thing, or can it be piecemeal?
Absolutely should. I would actually say it should not. You should not look to immediately try to take on and eat all of the CMMI model, right? If you're just starting out, right? So the CMMI model, for those that are not familiar, it's broken down into just like almost any type of model. It's broken into categories or boxes. You'll hear Simona and I talked about that as domains, but our primary language that we use in that is practice areas. And so there's over 24 practice areas. The exact count, don't quiz me on that at this moment, because there are some in transition and being implemented. But there's just about over 24. So a practice area then is it represents a set of best practices in an area in which work is performed, right? So you can think of in your organization, perhaps you are curious as to how your training function is performing. Well, there's a practice area related to training called organizational training. You could just look at using that particular practice area. Now, probably if you're working with somebody from like a CMMI appraiser, like myself or another CMMI appraiser, they're probably going to recommend that you would look at some other practice areas as well, right? So planning is another practice area in which there are practices. And how do you plan that training? What are the requirements? That's another practice area. How you do the requirements of your training. How do you monitor that training is effective? How is leadership creating sponsorship for that training? So that's 4 or 5 practice areas. You don't have to take them. You could right size this for the value of your organization, right? In terms of which of these practice areas are going to allow me to assess the capabilities of a functional set of work that we perform. And that can be my training department, that could be my procurement department, could be my IT department, could be how we do software development, could be how we do manufacturing, could be our sales cycle, could be our support desk, could be any number of things that you have within the organization. So I actually recommend that you, when considering these things, again, when you consider all the processes in an organization, that's an elephant, right? And as the old saying goes, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So actually looking at these things within the functional groups or teams or processes or projects or products that you're working with may be a much more effective way, and then right-sizing that with the practice areas, right? So if I'm looking at the training department, looking at supplier agreement may not necessarily be as important. Yeah, there might be tools that we're doing from a supplier agreement perspective, and maybe we want to talk about that. But maybe that's outside the bounds of our scope that we want to consider. So you don't have to take it all on. You don't have to take it all the way up to, we've alluded to the fact that there is a stair-step fashion within the model of maturity and capability levels. You can look at it to whatever level makes sense to your organization. But the primary rule, and it's one that I use all the time, is what's going to provide value back to the organization, right? So when considering what to look at in the organization in terms of scope, when considering what practice areas to look at, to use in an organization, and what's particular levels of capability, those 3 really need to be weighed against what's the appropriate value that would be provided back to the organization.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm already seeing questions are coming in, and on the way to weave in one of the questions, I want to ask you about another myth around different methodologies, right? We're all familiar with different methodologies like Agile, like ISO, like TOGAF for enterprise architecture. So what would you say to people saying that CMMI doesn't work well with other methodologies, or they're not fitting well with each other? You don't have to do CMMI if you're doing, let's say, TOGAF for enterprise architecture, and vice versa.
So, I mean, this is a myth that we've been trying to bust for at least a decade, especially with Agile, right? There was this, there was this entire idea that that many folks put out with when Agile really started to take roots, maybe about 15, 20 years ago. There was a lot of thinking that the CMMI model was prescriptive of a waterfall or maybe even a V-style type of methodology, and that is patently false. Regardless of what type of methodology you're using in development or services or in acquisition, the model is agnostic in terms of the statements of practices. It really is focused on the what with any particular best practice, not the how, right? So regardless if you are an Agile shop, a shop that's regulated, but by government regulations, how do you go about? I'm sorry, you still are expected. Say take planning of any particular process. You want to involve the necessary and key stakeholders, as an example. The model has an expectation of that. It doesn't say, oh, you have to do this in a stand-up meeting, or you have to do this in a phase gate milestone meeting. Now, within the model, there is additional explanatory information as to if you're dealing with an agile shop or if you're dealing with more of a waterfall shop. These are some things that you may see or you may want to consider leveraging. So there are cues in there to help organizations that are leveraging the model, or help even to help appraisal teams understand what they might be seeing. But that's not prescriptive of we expect to see, again, going back to Agile, we expect to see the daily stand-up where everybody's standing up for 15 minutes. It's, by the way, every time I deal with an Agile shop, everybody's got their own flavor of Agile anyway as to how they're going about using it, which is fine because they're defining it in a way that's going to be of value back to their organization. So the point here, though, is there's long been a myth that CMMI is prescriptive to a particular life cycle, or a particular methodology. And that's absolutely not the case. I enjoy being able to work with organizations and have the opportunity to see how different organizations approach different life cycles, but the model still has applicability from organization to organization that I get the opportunity to work with.
Great, thank you so much. So there is a question from Shruti that's kind of related, and how important is to have CMMI done on enterprise architecture?
Well, yeah, I think you can ask the question, how important is CMMI to be done on, and you can fill in the blank there. How important is it to be done on my customer service? How important is it for it to be done on our sales cycle? How is important for it to be done on our software development life cycle? That is a question that is about what's the value? How important is that to your organization? And I'm not trying to dodge the question here. Is if your enterprise architecture, and I'm assuming a little bit about the way you're speaking about that this might be a software solution. If you're looking to maybe just create software for a couple of folks in your just in your business as an internal solution, the enterprise architecture or relationship diagrams, if it's fit for use, maybe you don't need to do a lot there. If you're looking to create a solution that is going to be long-term scalable, it's going to perform for thousands or hundreds of thousands of customers, that you're concerned about maybe how much technical debt you may be acquiring as a part of that software solution. The CMMI is definitely a model in which I would suggest that you leverage some of those practice areas to help with that longer term implementation. It really depends, right, as to what's your goals as a business, what's most important to you as a business. A couple practice areas that come out in my mind when thinking about that is there's one practice area called technical solution, which is really about how do you design solutions to meet the requirements of your customers. And so I think there's, to understand your question a little better, I'd want to understand some of the questions behind the question, which is, what's the goals of that particular enterprise architecture? What's the goals of your businesses and from a performance perspective? What are some of the other factors that are impacting your business right now? Maybe there's something that's more important. But if you're looking to build something that is useful, efficient, scalable, then the use of CMMI as a model in consideration of building out that architecture could be very helpful to your business as you grow and want to meet or exceed performance expectations.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, enterprise architecture can touch on solutions, the technical architecture, a cybersecurity architecture. So again, CMMI can be a very holistic approach. And in fact, we have a lot of examples to this effect. Back to the methodologies, there is a question from Nicholas around ISO 27001, NIST 800, especially all of those that are in the cybersecurity world. They're also using now CMMC 2.0, etc. What is the similarity with CMMI? There are so many regulations out there.
Yeah, so the 27001, this is interesting. As long as I have been involved in CMMI, there's been a strong desire and many efforts to map it to any number of other ISO standards and regulations. I've gone through the activity of mapping it myself to 9001. 1345, 14971. I know there's existing white papers out there of how it maps to 27001, 20001. I know there's been a lot of activity in the last couple of years in discussing about its map and its applicability to CMMC. The very nature that people can go through and do that sort of mapping exercise indicates to me its usefulness and its applicability to any number of other standards, right? So it's almost the same question that you just asked me, which is there a specific methodology that it has to tie to? And I think the answer is no, it's not. There's not a specific methodology. It could be very complementary in helping with any of those other particular standards. I would also caution, though, that the meeting the standard of one it's not necessarily always reciprocal, right? So you've heard me refer to a couple times now a program that I'm very heavily involved in with ISACA is that medical device discovery appraisal program. So there are regulations there, right? And ISO standards there that complement CMMI very well, right? So when we look at, say, again, supplier agreement management, that goes really well with medical device regulation. For those of you medical device nerds that might be listening, 820.50, right? Those go together really well. But you're not going to see anything. I mean, there's certain expectations in regulation on the medical device side of it, like a design history file, or in Europe, the technical file. You're not going to see anything from a language perspective there that maps the specifically within CMMI, right? So you have to think about how are you going to use the CMMI to complement your expectations that may be driven to you from an ISO standard and how they're applicable within your particular business. So if you're really focused, cybersecurity, if you're really focused on that, the CMMI can be very complementary in assisting you from a cybersecurity journey and maybe even achieving CMMC. But the CMMI is also still applicable for organizations that might have zero or very little, perhaps, cybersecurity considerations if they're just in strict hardware manufacturing. I understand that there's cybersecurity concerns there as well, potentially, but maybe not the same way as if you're making software that's going to be available on the cloud or on the internet. So, in short, I think that idea that that one meets the other is something that you have to consider model by model or ISO standard by ISO standard or regulation. But the takeaway from that is that I think the CMMI is a methodology that, is a set of best practices, not a methodology that can complement any of those particular standards.
Okay, one more myth here. CMMI is time-consuming, expensive, check-the-box audit. What would you say to this?
That's a mouthful, right? So I don't think it's time-consuming. I remember one of the first appraisals I was on about a decade ago. We were asking, there's a practice area about peer review, and we were asking a participant in one of our interviews about their peer review processes, and the person said they said these things take up a lot of time. And we said, well, what would you do to make that better? And they said, I wouldn't, because if you want to be good at push-ups, you have to do push-ups. Okay. So I'm not going to, bust this myth by saying this is zero time or this is zero, effort. If you want to have mature, fit, capable, efficient processes, those are things that are going to take some investment from an organization to develop that capability. Now, there should be an ROI, right? When you make that particular investment in your organization's fitness, if I use that analogy, you should be able to demonstrate that you are getting that back from a return perspective in customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, in revenue, in growth, in less defects, and whatever it is that you set from a target perspective. So that investment, yes. Will it take time? Yes. And should it be worthwhile to you? Absolutely. If you can't understand that value, then you either need to go back and consider where the value would be, or you might want to consider, approaching it from a different approach altogether. And it's not just an audit, right? An appraisal is something that can be leveraged for an organization to assess where you're at. But the best practices are there, regardless if you do an appraisal or what maybe some of you are calling an audit. We prefer the term appraisal, typically within the CMMI. But the best practices are there even outside of the appraisal, right? So yes, an audit might be leveraged for you to demonstrate we're at maturity level 3 or capability level 2 or whatever it might be. But it's not just for that particular purpose. They're there all the time, 24/7, 365 days of the year, to be considered to improve the performance of your organization at any point.
So there are a couple questions that are similar, except they're in different sectors, different domains. So you gave example about the medical devices, but folks are asking, what are the benefits of applying CMMI blank? One is around the banking industry, the other one is educational sector. So if you can pull any stories or anything pertinent to address those questions, I'll be grateful. Banking or educational sector?
Sure. We've actually done work with a small public school system in Missouri, leveraging CMMI. I've often given this example, and I know we're tight for time, but the first job I ever had and I'm going to use a very simple example just to get people to think about how it might be applicable, not just for medical devices or large defense contractors, but hey, for banking or public school systems, right? My first job as a teenager was in a pizza shop, right? And as I think about that, there's processes in a pizza shop, right? We have suppliers bringing stuff in the back, cheese, sauce, flour to make dough. We have customers coming in the front. We have to deal with orders for those particular customers. It's, there's an oven, so we have an environment in which we have to work. We have to package things up. The flow of work changes, like 2:00 in the afternoon on a Tuesday is different than the flow of work that's expected on on a Friday night at 8:00. We had complaints. Hey, my pizza wasn't cooked appropriately. There's all these processes, and we had to train people when they came in. There's all these things that were applicable in a pizza shop, a small little pizza shop in Ellington, Connecticut, of all places, right? And so because I can look back at that and I could say, you know what, we had requirements, we had to plan work, we had to measure how things were done. Leadership had to set a tone as to how things were occurring. We had to train people, we had to deal with suppliers, we had to deal with incidents. We had to verify and validate, that we were delivering things appropriately. The fact that I could go back to that pizza shop in which maybe at most on a Friday night, 8 people were working in there, outside of software, a small organization. And I could say, you know what, the CMMI could have applicability there. I think would serve as a model to say that the CMMI has applicability in all sorts of industries, right? So in your banking sector, are you planning work? Yeah. Do you have requirements? Yeah. Do you have to measure how you're performing? Yes. Do you have customers by which you want to make sure that you're validating that the product that you're providing or the service that you're providing to them meet their needs? So you have to train people? Yeah. All those things have applicability in almost any industry, right? I would question if somebody says those things aren't applicable to the industry. Tell me. I want to hear that, because if you don't have requirements, then maybe you don't have customers, frankly. But so I think there's applicability in again, small, large, software, banking, education, defense. There's a broad swath of applicability that the CMMI, and frankly, that's why I think that's the beauty in the CMMI is by way of how it has evolved. And its very definition, it's a set of best practices that have a grand set of applicability not just for one business or one style of methodology, but across all sorts of market sectors.
Well, that's a great place for us to end today's conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, George. And thank you to all of you for attending today's ISACA Live. You can learn more about CMMI at www.isaca.org/CMMI, where you'll find a free resource called CMMI Your Top Questions Answered. I encourage you to download it and share it with any colleagues who might benefit from learning more. Thank you for being with us today, and have a great day.